Thank you, Scott, and thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon to hear about something which I hope you feel is as important as Scott mentioned, and I believe, which is how to make your life more rich and enjoyable and meaningful. Yes, well, I was told when I started my speaking career after out of graduate school that one should start a lecture with some simple question that would get people involved on a easy way with what comes later. So let me start with my easy question, which I hope to unpack as we go on. And that question is, what is life? Now that question obviously would have very different answers depending on whether you ask it from a chemist or a biologist or a theologian. As a psychologist, I propose to answer the question of what is life with a very simple definition, which is that life really is the content of what a person experiences from birth to death. In other words, what we consider our life is all the feelings, perceptions, thoughts, emotions that we have been conscious of from throughout the 70, 90, whatever years of our life. So I'm not concerned about life in terms of what happens to the body, but rather what takes place in the mind. And once you start thinking about experience as being the content of what our life is, you realize some general problems that underline our ability to really live well. One is that the amount of experience that can register in consciousness, the kind of things we can become aware of, is really very limited. As William James, the first great American psychologist, said over 100 years ago, there are millions of things clamoring for our attention around us, and we can only see very few of them. We can only register very few of them. This is a more recent way of thinking about the limits of attention, of what we can actually experience at any given time. And while I would ask you not to take the numbers too seriously, because nobody has actually counted how many bits a person can process during a lifetime, a good ballpark figure is that you can register about 114, 110, 120 at the most bits of information per second. In other words, you can become aware of 120 distinct impressions, if you want to call them, during per second at the most. And this may seem to you like a lot, but actually, for instance, for somebody to understand a speaker in their native language, it takes about 60 bits of information to decode the sounds that you hear into words and then connect the words to memories that will give meaning to those words. So essentially, you can, if 60 bits are needed for understanding one person, 60 bits a second, it means, of course, that you can't really understand two people speaking to you at the same time. And that's a huge obstacle to experience, for instance. I mean, there are 8 billion people in the world at this point, more or less, and we can only hear one of them at a time and understand what they say. So this limit on attention has to include everything that passes through your experience. That means what you feel. For instance, you have to register that you are hungry, that you want to do something in 15 minutes, you have some appointment to do. all of these kind of memories or expectations as well as feelings and sensations all come out from this very limited bottleneck of information that we need to pass experiences through if we want to have them. Otherwise, they don't exist as far as we are concerned. So when you look over time at what happens to us in a lifetime, you see that you could multiplying 114 per second per 18 hours of being, or 16 hours of waking time, 70 years of lifetime, let's say, you have 168 billion items or bits of information that could constitute what your life is. And it looks again like a huge amount of experience that you could live through in a life, but it's not really that much, because you begin to think that when you start counting where these moments of experience come from, you see that every day we have to process about 150,000 bits per day in something which is required for us by the kind of survival pressures we have, like working, or if you're young, studying. So that's about roughly 1/3 of all the information comes from things that we have to do and we have often very little choice about. Then there is another roughly 1/3 which we can, which has to be devoted to processing information that has to do with maintenance, like dressing, eating, cleaning, traveling, and all the other things that need to be done in order, shopping and so forth. Just to go by, just to restore things to order and so that you have a decent, more or less decent life. And then that leaves then, at least in our culture nowadays, about 1/3 of the time during which we can experience things and process information, it's free time. And that is not committed, and we can choose to use it as we wish. The ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle used to believe, or say they believe, that humans can be truly human only during leisure, only during this time where there is no pressure to do something in order to survive or to keep things going along. But they thought of leisure, in fact, as not a time to have fun or to relax, but as a time for growth, for learning. In fact, the term for leisure in Greek used to be skolia, which was the root from which our word school comes from. In other words, the Greek thinkers thought that free time was essentially equivalent to going to school. That is, because that was a freely chosen activity done in order to perfect one's skills, to enlarge one's mind, and that's what free time was for. Now, in these three divisions, by the way, of time use or attentional processing are very general, very universal. You find them even in primates, in baboons, chimpanzees living in the tropics and so forth. They spend about the same amount of time doing these things. And in preliterate societies, you find generally, actually in some societies, even very simple societies, the proportions are a little different. You work less and you spend more free time, but essentially they vary. They stay the same. In our in the last few hundred years, we have seen huge swings in the proportions of these three activities. For instance, during the Industrial Revolution, at the end of the 18th century, people worked almost twice as long under pretty bad conditions, and they had very little free time to do anything with. We have a lot of free time compared to most periods of history, but we don't generally use it the way Aristotle thought we should for perfecting our physical and mental abilities. It's mostly watching television that is taking up, that's the single largest source of information that we process during free time. So this is kind of the background that gives you a sense for what the quality of life really entails. It entails using these opportunities to process information in ways that will make our life better in the present and make it more likely to be more enjoyable, more exciting in the future. In other words, to invest attention, which is the attention is the gate through which information comes into the mind, to invest attention in ways that increase the likelihood of having a life which is desirable, which you want to do, which you enjoy for its own sake. So I started studying essentially this set of questions by first looking at creative individuals, because I thought that creative artists, scientists, athletes are living in a way that seems to optimize this ability to process information. That is, they do things that they like to do, they do things that they think are important, they enjoy the moment as they do it, and usually also the consequences of it. So I thought that a creative group of people would help to exemplify what is the best strategy for living, in many ways, a good life. And I talked about creativity yesterday, so I won't talk about it now, but I will talk about this common experience of creative individuals that yesterday I already showed this particular slide, so I won't go too much in detail here. This is from a composer of music interviewed 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, and he's describing how the composition of music produces an ecstatic state which is so intense that you feel almost as if you don't exist when you do it, because he's processing probably at least 120 bits of information per second, just trying to imagine how to create a good piece of music, something that didn't exist before, but he wants desperately to capture in his notes that he puts on paper. So he is so involved in putting those notes down that he's not aware that he's tired, that he may be, he has responsibilities, that this perhaps in a couple of hours that he should be worrying about his income tax or whatever. He's completely, all of his attentional capacity is taken up by the production of the score that he's trying to write. I could spend the rest of the hour talking about just trying to parse this one little quote from a long interview, but here is another one, a poet who was interviewed by a former student of mine who wrote a book called Writing in Flow, and she interviewed some leading writers and poets, and it describes this moment when the poet essentially enters the state of ecstasy that comes when you move from the reality of everyday life, where you feel forced to do the kind of things that everybody else does or that you should be doing. And you, through making words come out with a new meaning, with a new form, in a beautiful way, you feel that you have entered a new reality. You have passed from one type of, from one world of experience into a new world. And this poet describes it, as you see, as an attempt to open a door that floats in the sky, and you're floating next to it, and you're trying to grab and open the door and enter this new world where your words are creating a more harmonious kind of reality. But it's not something you can force. You are being pulled by the gravity of everyday life concerns. You're trying to avoid temporarily that pull of gravity and enter into this world that you are trying to make to come about. Now, this sounds perhaps too poetic to some of us, but it's very similar actually to what Einstein, when he described how his ideas for the theory of relativity in physics came about, he used almost the same images of being in the sky, floating, and seeing these shapes trying to get together and form almost like puzzle pieces fitting. And he was trying to put them together, but he couldn't, and there was this force of the old way of thinking pulling him back. So it's not a kind of romantic description. This is fairly accurate as to how it feels when you are ready to enter this state. But it doesn't happen only in the arts. For instance, athletes I mentioned experience it too. And this is from a psychologist in Australia, Susan Jackson, who interviewed some of the leading athletes, Olympic athletes, and especially figure skaters, which is her sport. When you read this description, you see some of the same elements that the poet and the musician mentions, namely that it seems to be almost spontaneous, automatic. You don't have to think. You are an automatic pilot. You don't have thoughts extraneous to what you're trying to accomplish. You don't even realize that the music is something that comes from outside. You feel like the music is inside you. You are inside the music. It's again a condensation of experience that comes from being so attentive to what you're doing. In this case, the very difficult physical movement. You have to pay so much attention to that you hear somehow the music, but you're not thinking of it as music. It's just you pay enough attention to move with it, but it's not. You don't say, "Oh, here I am skating to the music." You're too involved to think of you as separate from what you're doing. So this is very typical. Now, we were interested in what conditions make this kind of experience possible. And, well, first of all, the experience is defined essentially by this heightened concentration. People, when they are really focused, concentrated, that's a prerequisite. And that's the way you can tell whether somebody's in flow. You can be in flow you can concentrate for other reasons too. For instance, if you're trying to escape from a raging bull or something, you concentrate on what's happening. But so it's not the only thing. It's not sufficient to be in flow, but it's certainly a necessary condition. When the concentration reaches a certain depth, then you step outside this ordinary reality in which we live most of the time, and you experience the world in a somewhat different way, sometimes completely differently. And that's why the word ecstasy, which in Greek meant to stand to the side of something, you feel like you're standing to the side of the kind of life that you usually lead, and you have a new life. Now, this happens usually when the things to do are quite clear. You have very clear goals. For instance, games and artistic activities have this advantage of giving you very clear goals. Imagine, you're playing tennis, every second where you want the ball to go, and you get feedback, which is very important. You know whether you're doing things right or not. So a tennis player is constantly able to check whether their intentions match their behavior and the response they get from the other people. A musician can play, let's say, an instrument, a violin, knows what notes they want to play the next moment, and they can hear whether the note is the kind of one that they want to produce. So that kind of feedback, clarity of goals and feedback are kind of essential. And then the other condition is that one should feel that what they can do is more or less enough to cope with the opportunities or challenges of the situation. Because if your skills are too low to what you have to do, you start feeling anxious. And if your skills are too high to what you have to do, the challenges are trivial, you feel bored, you start feeling bored. So that is a very important condition. When these first four things are in place, then you start forgetting yourself. You feel that you are at one with what you're doing. So the boundaries between myself and my activity disappear. And you are in a kind of blissful, selfless state, which is also, of course, the goal of many Eastern religious traditions, yoga and Zen and so forth. But it happens to everyone in every culture naturally when they are disinvolved in what they're doing. The interesting thing is we find that after people experience flow, though, their self-esteem goes up and stays up for quite a long time. In other words, there's this paradox that you have to forget yourself in order to increase the value that you put on yourself. And there are many variations of this, of people feeling at one with the team they're playing in, feeling at one with the music, feeling at one with the logic. When they play chess players tend to feel that as they play chess, they are not anymore kind of human beings with all their limitations. They are part of a kind of universal logic that rules the world, and they feel this almost omnipotent feeling, I'm pure reason now when I play. It's an interesting way in which you transcend your identity and lose yourself in this activity, and then you come back feeling stronger. In almost every case, people lose sense of time, and generally time seems to go very fast, but occasionally a very short period where you have to intensely experience it seems to stretch out. For instance, figure skaters, when they do those very difficult triple lutzes and stuff, they feel that fraction of a second lasts for minutes because they are registering, condensing so much information, kinesthetic, visual, auditory information, that it seems to stretch out. So the real bottom line here is that time is no longer just always the same, 60 seconds to a minute, etc. Experientially, time begins to become very flexible and it adapts, the sense of time adapts to what you're doing rather than the other way around. And then what's interesting is that when all these conditions are present, it becomes, what you're doing becomes intrinsically motivating or rewarding. That is, people may start out doing something that they really don't like very much to do, but if there is this opportunity to experience these 6 elements, then they say, gee, that wasn't bad, let me try it again. It felt good, I felt really alive, I felt that I was stretching myself, I was getting stronger or more skilled at what I was doing. And so because of this feature, it becomes very interesting to say, how can we change some of those activities that take up our time, that take up so much of our life, and produce boredom and or anxiety? How can we change them so that work becomes intrinsically rewarding, or family life becomes intrinsically rewarding? And that's really, okay, that's not, so this is what our research tends to deal with. I don't know why this went over. Oh, no. Let's talk. My assistant is very experimental, so occasionally I put in this kind of drum beats, which I don't expect. But this is kind of a short summary of the main forms of experience that we go through moment by moment as we go through a day or a week. We measure these things with a kind of technique that I developed 35 years ago, which is kind of interesting. We give people, we used to give them pagers, then we gave them watches that were electronic watches that could be programmed to go off at different moments. Now we use Palm Pilots. But essentially what we do is we give people, let's say, a pager, okay? That was the original work. And 8 times a day we sent a signal to the pagers, 8 times a day. So if you had a pager and it started beeping, you took out a little booklet we gave you and you wrote down what you were doing, where were you, how did you, what were you thinking about, who you were with, and then you would tell also how you felt during the day. 2 of the dimensions here were also in this booklet. So we could tell how much skill a person had at, that's the horizontal axis, how much skill the person felt he or she had at the moment when the beeper went off, and how many challenges they felt, that person felt at that moment. So the central point in this figure would be your average level of challenge and skill throughout the week. So you had 50 signals, 50 times you rated how many challenges, skills you had, and if you did that, you would come up with something like this. Namely, that if a person rated his challenge and skills above average, both, that person was likely to be in flow. In other words, he enjoyed what he or she was doing, concentrated, felt in control, felt creative, felt all kinds of different positive dimensions of experience. More than the rest of the week when they were in that particular channel of flow, high challenge, high skill. Now, the other 2 channels to the left and right of flow were also positive, but much less so. For instance, arousal was, if you rated yourself high challenge, average skills, arousal, there, if you are in that state, you feel concentrated, alert, and many other things, but you don't feel in control, you don't feel particularly happy. So you want to go, at that point, you would like to go back into flow when you're in that situation. And to go from arousal to flow, the best way, of course, is to increase your skills. And then you get back into that zone where you feel imbalance between what needs to be done and what you can do. And of course, therefore, that arousal state is probably the place where most learning happens. That is, you are doing something, you don't feel quite comfortable, you're paying a lot of attention, you try hard, but you are not, you can't let yourself go, you can't abandon yourself to the activity. So that's a very good place to learn from. Control is also a good situation because there your skills exceed challenges, and therefore you feel comfortable, you feel, gee, I can do this, no problem. So you are happy, in control, many good things, but you're not particularly, you don't feel particularly energetic, active, or creative. So it lacks something. And if you're in that state of control, of course, you can go into flow by taking up a higher challenge. And so that's also a good place to learn from, although we find empirically that generally it's more arousal to flow than control to flow. Control is almost too comfortable, and people very often, unless they are really committed to something, they just they are there without feeling too bad. So as you go around the circle, however, you find more and more unpleasant situations. Relaxation is still good, but then you get to boredom. When the skills, you are using much fewer skills and the challenges are low, and that is already a fairly negative state. Then apathy is in many ways the worst, because there you don't feel there's anything to do, and you're not using any of your skills. And then as the challenges go up again, but the skills remain low, you enter the state of worry, where you feel really uncomfortable, and finally anxiety, where you feel incapable to cope with the challenges. And that is, for experientialists, the worst state. People want to get out of anxiety more than anything else. Yet we find that in terms of long-term effect, apathy is even worse. That is, if you spend too much time in apathy, you are going to have a worse prognosis in the long term than if you spend it in anxiety, unless the anxiety becomes completely chronic, all the time, in which case that's bad too. But anyway, these are the kind of conditions that we keep moving in and out of every day. Usually, when you are in flow, you are doing whatever you like to do best. This could be a hobby, it could be your work if you love your work, it could be a relationship that goes well, a friendship, whatever. But all the best things that people really like to do tend to be there, and that's when people feel the best. Control, it turns out that most of the responses to control come from when people drive a car. Unless, of course, there is, let's say, a snowstorm, in which case you would be in anxiety, or you're stuck in a traffic jam, then it's apathy. But generally, control is fairly positive, and driving a car, your work, if you feel comfortable at work, etc. Relaxation has to do with things like eating, resting, talking to friends without too much excitement or involvement, but it's relaxing. Boredom is mostly housework and things you have to do, maintenance, the kind of maintenance activities are there. Apathy tends to be the biggest single group of responses there is watching TV, and then there is sitting in the bathroom, and things of that sort. I mean, things that don't really engage terribly. Although watching television can be flow, very rarely, but it's flow about 5 to 7% of the time. People watch something which gets them really involved. For some people, it's a good sport event. where they are hoping that one of the teams would win, or a good drama or something. But generally, TV is not there. Worry becomes something that usually work-related or home-related, where you're worrying about things happening that you have no control over, you don't know how to cope with. Usually colleagues at work, whereas anxiety is almost generally has to do with bosses at work, or events that you don't have control over, like your children are not at home at night when they should be, and things of that sort. So this is kind of the spectrum of experiences that we go over day by day, week by week. And the question that I'm interested in saying is that, look, these different qualities of experience add up over time to different lives, right? Going back to what we said at the beginning, that life is the sum of the experiences we go through from birth to death. It makes a tremendous difference whether our life has, it's mostly apathy or mostly control, and hopefully that it has some sprinkling of flow in it here and there. We find that about 10 to 15% of the people generally claim never to have experienced flow, and usually this is a very, very symptomatic of a life that is poorly lived, that is not experienced. About 10% of the people at the other end say that they have flow, 10 to 12%, that they experience flow every day. And generally these people actually have a life which is rich in challenge and where they can use their skills. The other kind of 70 to 80% of people, depending on the place you are doing the survey, the other 70 to 80% of the people have this experience, optimal experience, only rarely. I mean, some once a week, once a month. People say, well, when I go mountain climbing, or when I go scuba diving, or when I go to hear a good opera, I get into this experience, but not very often. So the question as a psychologist that I would like to spend the rest of my career doing, trying to figure out, is how to increase the number of experiences, the frequency and intensity of experiences that are in that flow channel. Partly because that enriches our life, but has many other applications. For instance, I will just talk a little bit about the ways in which, just 2 more minutes. Okay. This last year, I was flying American Airlines, and I found this thing in their flight magazine, on board magazine, American Way, and it is all about how flow works in business settings and to improve the quality of working life. And that is also something that I just wrote this book called Good Business, and this is the cover of the German version of Newsweek magazine called Focus. And this is a cover story about happiness on the job, glücklich im Job. And this whole magazine was about the book, it says from the new book from the flow research of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So anyway, these are things that have really almost nothing to do with, but people are using it, applying it. this is Consumers Reports who, this little sidebar there says finding flow in free time, and they relate to how you use free time to health. This is a series of studies, partly I did, partly my students, partly they made it up, I guess. I don't know, but they are claiming this great health effects. And here is another one. For instance, this is by the American Arthritis Society, which has to do with, and they claim that engaging in flow reduces pain from arthritis, and they quote some of the work that suggests that. And actually, we have done research with women with breast cancer and so forth, and you find out that it's the same thing with pain as it is with, for instance, self-consciousness. In other words, if you are really into what you're doing, if you are able to, even temporarily, to get involved in something, which could be you're doing, or you passively get involved in music or art in some form, if you're involved in that enough, you can't feel the pain. There is no room in your consciousness to process the information about pain. And this is what this Arthritis Society claims. We found this with, as I say, women with breast cancer. One of my former students did research on that. So the question of, these are just some of the applications, and I could spend a long time talking about many others that I come up against recently. There has been a publication about how even schizophrenia can be alleviated through focusing and using your skills in a way that it's not either overmatched or undermatched. But I could go on, as I say, but I have talked for 45 minutes, which was the limit I was given. So I better stop here. And as you were told, there are microphones out there and around here. So I hope there are some questions, because some of the best stuff comes out in the questions. So I hope we'll get some good ones, okay?
I just wanted to ask about Nazism and flow, fascism and flow. Does flow automatically lead to happiness even when there's evil involved in the outcome?
Yeah, I think that's an essential question to deal with, because flow is by itself value-free in the sense that flow is a form of energy that can be used, like all energy can be used for good or bad purposes. Whether electricity, you could use it to connect it to an electric chair, or you can use it to make your breakfast or illuminate a library. So the point is that I think it's important to understand how this energy works so that we can put it to good use, because if we don't put it to good use, then people will hijack this knowledge and use it. And people like the Nazis were very aware of how to manipulate flow for young people for their purposes. So it's important that we can harness this energy for the good purposes. And this was something Plato wrote about 25 centuries ago. Plato, quoting Aristotle in the Republic, said that the most important thing for teachers to do is to teach young people to feel pleasure in the right things. And this is something we forgot. We don't teach pleasure in the right things, and so people find it, that young people find it somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question, because what you kind of suggest with flow seems to borderline with the mysticism. And I'm just kind of wondering whether you think maybe there's like a supernatural element to it or whatsoever.
Well, it depends. I think that I tried to, using Occam's razor, to not to use entities that are not necessary. I would not use supernatural explanations for what I find. I think that people attribute supernatural sources to the states of ecstasy because they are so different from what they experience in everyday life. And certainly, Eastern traditions of producing flow through meditation and through rituals and Zen are very effective in producing flow, but not because, I don't think because they're supernatural, it's because they're disciplines that get the body and the mind to take on challenges that allow them to lose themselves in this activity of meditation. Yeah. Okay.
I had a question about the external circumstances contributing to the possibility of flow, particularly, say, physical health or fitness or drug use. And if you've studied the effects of those types of things, of circumstances on the report of flow?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was looking there, but you're there. Okay. I personally haven't done much of that, but some of my colleagues, especially at the University of Milan in Italy, have done work with drug addicts and real severe heroin addicts, and also with people with severe disabilities like loss of sight, loss of motorcycle accidents where you become paralyzed, quadriplegics, and so forth. And I reported that in one of the chapters in the book. Very interesting studies that they did. Obviously, you change the kind of activity that produces flow when you get into one of those situations. And strangely enough, many people who lose the use of their body or their sight end up, after a while, getting more flow out of life than they did before, at least by their account, and they seem to be fairly well corroborated by their work, because everything becomes challenging. Things that before you took for granted, and every little victory of being able to dress yourself, or some of them become able to use their minds much better than before and get flow from their minds, or others, you have quadriplegics who become archery champions from the chair. They sit and they can use somehow them. I mean, there are many, many interesting possibilities that people who are able to put two and two together can live a better life even afterwards. I don't know if that's what you were asking, but that's what comes to mind. Okay?
That was him up there.
Oh, okay.
If I
I'm
could,
getting more and more confused, sorry.
perhaps my question will follow on this in a way. You're speaking about increased ability to flow when certain cognitive functions or waking functions have been diminished. Has there been research done into what you might call heightened states of unconsciousness? For example, the phenomenon of lucid dreaming, and how that might relate to the effects or the process of flow.
Yeah, there are some of these kind of almost paranormal states that seem to have some of the attributes. For instance, one of my colleagues at Chicago, Erica Fromm, who was one of the great hypnosis researchers, she thinks that self-hypnosis is a form of flow, for instance, and we argued about this for a long time. Partly because I don't see skills in that. Maybe in getting in the state, yes, but once you are under a hypnotic in a trance, whether you induced it or someone else, I don't see that it involves the use of skills. And you use the different, you didn't use hypnosis, but
No, I use lucid dreaming.
lucid
And
dreaming.
I speak as someone who has experienced flow in creative context in several ways, but I've also experienced lucid dreaming states and found that, you know, as other people have, one, there are techniques whereby you can prepare yourself before going to sleep to experience a lucid dreaming state, and in that state to really concentrate and find solutions to problems that you might not with your waking mind. And so I was just wondering if there's been anything done in terms of linking these two phenomena, you know, where there might be a bridge between them.
Well, in the book, I think, in the flow book, I think, I talk about the particularly interesting anthropological study of the Sinoi in New Guinea, who are apparently able to do what you're just describing, because from childhood on, a child in this particular tribe is expected to tell their dreams to their parents every morning during breakfast, and you're telling the parents, for instance, that I don't know, that you stole your neighbor's chicken or something. If that was your dream, then your parents say, "Oh, okay, here is a chicken, give it back to the neighbors." In other words, children are taught to take responsibility for their dreams. After a while, these Sinoi are supposed to be able to lucid dream, what has become known as lucid dreaming. In other words, control the content of their consciousness while asleep. But that's very rare, and I don't know how frequent really lucid dreaming is, but if it is like you say, that you can train yourself to organize your mind while asleep, then that would be flow-like, because you are developing a skill that other people don't have, and you are trying to use it in that context. I would have to say that's could be flow, produce flow, yeah. But other dreams, normal dreams, are not, because you have no control over them. You are not using skills. They just unconsciously, your body is generating, your nervous system is generating kind of images, but you have no control over them. You can't stop and start and change, which is, I suppose, what lucid dreaming can do, if it does that.
Say a person has involved in a certain part of the arts and finds a certain flow involved in that, has reached that state of flow, but then they experience some personal events in their lives that changes that makes it hard for them to find that flow again in that, what they had done before. Is it wise to try and force getting back into that flow, or maybe find a new direction in a new interest that you can find that flow in?
Yeah, well, that's quite a question. I really don't have any direct advice, because I find that people seem to recover from these blocks that are caused by kind of life events in different ways. I mean, some people persevere, other people try to. I think the most effective ways, though, that I can, in my experience, from the most effective one is to try to do something else that, for a while, that gets your mind off both your, whatever tragedy or trauma caused your block, and also takes your mind away from trying to push through that block. But something which is appealing. I mean, most, the typical prescription for a case like that in the 19th century was to travel. You go see new places, try to experience new life forms, and I still think that's not a bad way. If you really had a vocation, a calling for whatever you were doing before, I think sooner or later that will come back. After sometimes a year, takes maybe two. But eventually you can't resist not going back to what gave you joy before. But people are different. Oh,
realize that Simon and Priest have done some work with experiential education and outdoor interrelationships with flow. However, I guess my question was directly related to the fact, as an outdoor, or I guess as a leader of any type, you know, when you're especially doing high-risk activities, at that point, I see a possible inherent danger with, as a group leader, interjecting yourself into that state of flow, although you would want to maximize your group into some type of an autotelic experience. Could you, I guess, expound on that, or do you agree or disagree? I don't know.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. You are saying that as a leader, you want to get your group in flow, but you yourself don't want to get too involved in and enjoy, experience it because you have responsibility for the welfare of the group. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting paradox there. I think it's something that I certainly wouldn't want to recommend you to forget the safety of people who depend on you, so that you have and you enjoy your thing yourself. I think that's I guess probably the best recipe then is that the leader of such group should be someone who enjoys protecting the group from harm, right? And that makes you feel good about what you're doing. Yeah.
Hello. You've been talking about the psychology of optimal experience. I'm sort of curious about the psychology of frustration, and thinking specifically about your arousal area where your skills are not quite high enough perhaps to meet your challenges, and wondering is a long period of sort of not quite getting there necessary to get to flow? I'm curious, when you talked about people who had a lot of flow, do they spend a lot of time in deadlock as well? Is there a way to sort of move beyond the deadlock into flow?
Yeah, this kind of blocking of one's flow experience is usually not, it's usually temporary, unless something really bad happened to you that really threw you off your pace. But usually you can recover from it quite quickly. And good artists, good writers, good scientists usually find ways of getting into flow when they are frustrated or when they are blocked. And there are innumerable stories about what people do when they hit a block as temporary block. I mean, one of my favorites, for instance, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, who had trouble focusing on his writings in the morning because he had too many things. Probably he wasn't a lucid dreamer. He had dreams in his head. He was whatever, but he couldn't do it. So what he used to do, he lived in the Provence in the south of France. He used to get up in the morning around 8 and go sit in the garden outside in the full sun until about 9:30. By then his head was completely, he would take off his wig, so he had, his head would be cooked by the sun. And by the time 9 o'clock, 9:30 arrived, he would go inside and he would be so free of any thoughts or any worries because his head had been kind of like in a microwave oven for a few minutes. So he could start writing, and he wrote without stopping then. That's one technique. Other people have to drink a quart of bourbon or whatever to get in that state. I mean, there are many ways of doing it, and some are more effective than others. But the thing is, if you want to avoid those blocks, you have to develop a personal strategy. There is no one silver bullet. But for instance, these 80 poets and writers that Susan Perry studied, they, each one of them could tell you exactly what they were doing, and they were all different. I mean, some people needed to caress their cat for 15 minutes, stroke their Persian cat before they could focus on the writings. Other needed 2 cups of coffee. Other needed go out, take a walk in the garden, whatever. So you have to discover the way to get away from the ordinary reality to this reality you're trying to create. That step is difficult to take. And if you can do that by helping yourself with some strategy, some habit that you cultivate, then it's much easier.
There are some of us who are interested in teaching, so we're looking at it from that point of view of helping others probably identify or get involved with the appropriate field or approach. Could you say something about how you think about the teacher being of help in promoting flow?
Yeah, I think I mentioned briefly that there is some research, especially at State University San Diego and elsewhere, that shows that the flow of teachers is contagious. That is, the best teaching happens when the teacher enjoys either the subject matter or the ability to communicate to students. Those are the 2 ways in which teaching is effective. That is, often when you ask students what made difference in their school experience, they say teacher X, let's say, and you ask, well, what did teacher X do? And say, oh, well, nothing, he was just such a crazy person. You say, what do you mean crazy person? And you say, well, he would stand there and talk about mathematics as if it was something beautiful, something something that mattered. So I kind of sit up and say, gee, maybe there is something there that I haven't noticed. And eventually I say, oh yeah, maybe it's good. So there is that enthusiasm, that concern for the subject matter, that if it's genuine and it's expressed genuinely, that produces involvement, engagement on the part of students. And the other way that students get hooked on learning is by seeing their teachers as somebody who cares for them as individuals and cares and is pushing or pulling them in that direction as people, and that is also very effective. And very often, for instance, these Nobel Prize winners whom I studied in '91, very creative people, almost to a person, to a man or woman, said they really learned very little in school, that classes didn't make much difference to them, but individual teachers did. And they did it by essentially extracurricular means. For instance, Linus Pauling, who had 2 Nobel Prizes by the end of his life, remembers 8th grade teacher who asked him to set up the chemistry experiments for the high school because he thought highly of him. Until then, he was really not that keen on doing that stuff. But as he felt he was singled out because he had something, he didn't know what he had, but the teacher saw something in him. And that got him involved, engaged, and almost all the people who achieved great prominence in art or sciences has stories like that. Not that somehow they got the knowledge from the teacher kind of in an abstract way. It was either because of the example of enthusiasm for something or the care that they felt and the belief that from the teacher in them as individuals. That's just off the cuff.
I think that's a great way to end the afternoon on that note. Would you give a round of applause, Professor? Okay. So many more questions. Thank you.